Hello and welcome back to another Eduonics tutorial. In this section, we'll be going over the different tools in Photoshop. And in this video, we'll be going over the selection tools. All the images displayed on your computer monitor are made up of pixels. Think of selections as highlighting groups of pixels so that you can edit them without affecting the rest of the image. In my video on layers, I introduced the concept of selections when I went up to the menu bar and clicked Select All. That function selected all the visible content of the layer that I had selected. I was then able to cut the content of that layer and paste it onto another layer in a whole different document. The selection tools allow us to get even more specific with our selections. So instead of selecting the whole layer, we can select in different shapes, paths, and even individual colors. Let's get started with the most basic of selection tools, the rectangular marquee tool. I'll go up and click it, and my mouse has changed from a pointer to a crosshair, indicating that we're currently using the selection tool. The way it operates is very straightforward. If you click and drag it on a layer, you can draw a rectangle of any size you like. When you're done dragging, you've isolated the pixels within the rectangle, excluding the ones outside of it. If you're unhappy with the dimensions of your selection, you can just start a new rectangle by clicking and dragging anywhere else on the layer. You may notice that when you hover your mouse over your selection, it changes from a crosshair into a pointer again. This indicates that you can click and drag the selection box to a different location. Note, however, that this will not affect the contents of the selection, only the selection box itself. If you want to move the contents of your selection, you need to switch back to the Move tool in the Tools panel and then click and drag. I'm going to press Ctrl-Z on my keyboard to undo what I just did. The rectangle isn't the only shape that we can use to select. If we right-click the tool, some more options show up. Let's use the elliptical marquee tool. This selection tool lets us make a circle. But this is definitely not a perfect circle. If you want the dimensions to scale perfectly in size, press and hold the Shift key either before or during dragging. This constrains our width and height to give us a perfect circle. So far, we've only been dragging our shapes from one end to the other. If you want your shape to start from the center, you can press and hold the Alt key before or during dragging. You can combine this with the Shift key to create a perfect circle starting from the center. Note that these keys will have the same effect on the rectangular marquee tool. The next selection tool, when we right-click our marquee tools, is the single row marquee tool. What this does is make a long horizontal selection with the height of only 1 pixel. Now, this isn't so much useful as it is just really hard to make a single pixel selection otherwise. And the single column marquee tool does the same thing, only it makes a vertical line instead. Let's move on to the next set of selection tools, the lasso tools. The first lasso tool lets us draw a specific path around what we want to select. For instance, I could draw a path around this girl's head. Now, when making selections, it's important to know that they need to be a closed path in order to work. So, if I start to make a circle, but I stop short, Photoshop automatically closes my path with a straight line. Let's say that I want to add to this selection to fill her whole head instead of starting a new selection. All I would have to do is press and hold the Shift key before I click and drag. You'll notice that a plus icon has appeared next to my lasso, and I can add to my existing selection. We could even use this to add to our selection in a totally different area. Like if I wanted to select the woman's head as well, I can once again just press and hold Shift before I start dragging. But what if I want to take away from my current selection? That's easy. All I would have to do is press and hold the Alt key this time, and you'll see that a minus icon appears right below my cursor. And I can click and drag to make a path of what I'd like removed. When selecting things in Photoshop, Shift and Alt are almost universal for adding or subtracting from selections. This brings us to the next lasso tool, the polygonal lasso tool. This one works like the normal lasso tool, only this one uses straight lines and points to make selections. To illustrate, I'm going to go up and switch to my cityscape image. I'd like to make a selection around this building in the middle here. I'll just click and release to create the starting point of my path. Then I'll click each edge of the building to set new points as I work my way around back to my starting point. As I get close, a circle icon appears next to my cursor. Then I'll just click to complete my selection path. What if I want to select everything but this building? Well, I could start a whole new selection and painstakingly select everything around the building, or I could just inverse the selection by going up to Select, Inverse. Now a bounding box has appeared around the edges of my image, showing us that we're currently selecting everything outside the building. To deselect, go back up to Select, Deselect. Now let's use the magnetic lasso tool. This one's pretty interesting. It basically lets us make a very rough selection, and it will automatically adjust the selection as we drag. It's like a smart lasso that sort of fills in the blanks as we go. Like all the selection tools, it has options in this above panel, allowing us to customize the way it operates. To deselect again, even quicker this time, we can press Ctrl-D on our keyboard. Our next selection tools are very cool. They're designed to make the selection process much faster, almost like the magnetic lasso tool. Let's go to the Quick Selection tool. Right away, you can see that our cursor isn't made of a precise point like it used to be, but instead is a broad circle. And when we use it, you can see that it automatically selects things beyond our reach as we drag it. By default, the Quick Selection tool is set to add to your selection. But again, we can press and hold Alt to subtract anytime we want. This tool almost seems to learn what we're selecting the more we use it. Another thing that makes this tool neat, you can customize the size of the cursor to be more broad or more precise. Just use the tool options up here to customize everything to your liking. You can also control its size with the bracket keys on your keyboard. Our next tool is the Magic Wand tool. I found that this is best for isolating backgrounds. One click and it selects the whole background. The settings for this tool play a big part in how it operates. The way the Magic Wand works is by selecting the color you initially click in addition to a number of similar colors closest to it. Right now, the tolerance is at 32, so it's selecting 32 shades of color nearest to what we first click. So the higher the tolerance, the more it selects. There's another important option here marked contiguous. And when we uncheck this, it will select every instance of the color you first pick, wherever it lies on the image. So, for example, if we click this yellow window here with contiguous checked, it will only select that window. But watch what happens when we uncheck contiguous and click that window again. This time it selects all the yellow in the entire image. Okay, that about wraps it up for the selection tools for now. There are more advanced ways to make selections, but we'll cover those in later videos. In the next video, we'll go over the next set of tools that are used to manipulate images. Hello and welcome back to another Eduonics tutorial. In this section, we'll be going over the different tools in Photoshop, and in this video, we'll be going over the manipulation tools. In my video on selection tools, I went over how to select specific areas of an image, isolating the pixels so they may be manipulated without affecting the rest of the image. Now that we know how to select a layer's contents, we're going to go over the tools we can use to manipulate those contents. Let's just get right into it. The first manipulation tool we have is the crop tool, directly below our quick selection and magic wand. When we select it, a bounding box appears around the edges of our canvas. But this time, there are these brackets that appear around the edges. And when we hover over those edges, our cursor changes into a double arrow. When we click and drag, we can see our original image dimensions are being grayed out, and our new image dimensions remain in full color. I'm going to hit Enter on my keyboard to commit this cropping. But watch what happens when we go back to our Move tool and try to move our image away from those edges. Those parts of the image that we cropped have been deleted and are no longer available. I want to undo my cropping, so I'm going to go back up and click the History button to reveal the History panel. The History panel is listing my most recent changes to this document, and we can see that crop is currently highlighted. To undo my crop, I'm just going to click the option above it. This is bringing us back to a history state in the document before I made my crop. We're going to go over the history panel in more detail later. For now, let's go back and click the crop tool again. I'm going to drag one of these edges further inside like I did before, but I'm not going to hit Enter just yet. This time, pay attention to these tool options in the top panel, and notice that our option to delete cropped pixels is checked by default. Go ahead and uncheck this. Then go over and click the check mark to commit this crop. Now, let's select the Move tool and try moving our image again. You can see that we cropped the visible portion of the canvas, but the full image still remains behind it. This allows us to tweak the dimensions of the canvas without deleting anything we might need later. Let's go back to our crop tool this time by hitting the C key on the keyboard, and then click the canvas. We can see that the invisible portions of the image that go beyond our canvas are visible within the crop window. And if we hover beyond the edges of the crop selection, our cursor changes into a curved double arrow. This is indicating that we can click and rotate freely. If we want to rotate in perfect angles, we can just press and hold the Shift key to constrain our rotation by 15-degree increments. Let's go back up to the tool options and cancel this current crop operation. To get to our next crop tool, right-click the current crop tool to bring up our options, and click the Perspective Crop tool. This one gets really trippy. Instead of just changing the width, height, and rotation, This tool actually changes the perspective of the whole canvas. Let's start by clicking in the canvas to set our first point. And as we click more points, we see a perspective grid stretching out. Now that we've made our 4 points, we'll click Enter. Now you can see that the tool has basically taken what was inside of our crop zone and stretched it to fit on a straight rectangular plane as our new canvas. Pretty trippy. I'm going to switch to a different photo that can better illustrate how the next tool works. Let's move on to our next tool by right-clicking the current crop tool and selecting the Slice tool. The Slice tool is mainly used in web design when you want to split an image into multiple images to assign as buttons for a web page. This photo is perfect to demonstrate this tool because it has plenty of open space between subjects for us to slice. I'm going to start by drawing a box around the first girl from her bottom right. Now, as I move towards the edge of the canvas, you can see that Photoshop wants to automatically snap this to align perfectly. This slice that we just made has a number on its top left, number 1. When using slices, they need to cover the entire surface of the image, so Photoshop has automatically made 2 more slices to fill the gaps. Let's continue with our next slice. Oops, I started the slice too far from the edge and it didn't snap into position properly. To fix this, simply hover over to the edge of the slice and drag it till it snaps where it should be. Now when I make this slice, you can see that it doesn't line up to our slices on top. This is not an issue at all. We can go ahead and proceed with our last slice. Okay, now our slices take up the whole image and it's ready to save for web. Oh, what about this mistake I made up here? Using the Slice tool, I'm no longer able to drag its edge to fix it. This is where our next tool comes in. Right-click the Slice tool and then click the Slice Select tool. Now we can select our third slice and fix its bottom edge. If we compare our slices with the numbers on their top left, we can confirm that there are 6 slices for our 6 subjects. To save these, go up to File, Save for Web. Now this is going to open up a very extensive dialog box. We're not going to go into this right now, but it sort of gives you an idea of the type of support Photoshop provides for web pages. I'm going to cancel this and then close this document. Okay, now we're getting into something a little more fun. So I'm going to pull up a different photo I can work with. Here's a woman who looks like she might be getting some surgical work done, as she has these marks on her face. A great way to remove marks like these, or other blemishes, is with the Spot Healing Brush tool. All we have to do is select the Spot Healing Brush tool and click and drag over one of these marks to remove it. What's happening here is that Photoshop is using its best guess as to what I want to remove, and it's sampling another area of the image to cover it. This tool is great for correcting the minor details. But you may find that if you get a little carried away, Photoshop is not going to be able to distinguish what you want and what you don't want as you use it. The next tool in the set works very similarly, only it gives you more choices that the Spot Healing Brush can't. When using the Healing Brush tool, you actually have to choose where you'd like to sample from. In order to set our sample location, we just have to press and hold Alt as we click. you can see the indication that we are setting the sample by the change in cursor when we press and hold the Alt key. Now Photoshop is still trying to guess for us, but it's using the sample that we set for it as a guide. The next tool that we have is the patch tool. Again, very similar, but it gives us a bit more freedom for what we want to specifically accomplish. With the patch tool, we have to manually make a selection as with the lasso tool, then drag our selection over to set our sample. This allows us to make some pretty major changes while making it seem fairly realistic. Next up is the Content-Aware Move tool. Think of this as the rest of our healing tools, but instead of painting over blemishes, this allows us to move things in our image while making it seem like they belong there all along. I'm going to go up to my lasso tool and make a selection around her mouth. Then I will switch back to the Content-Aware Move tool and click and drag her mouth up to her forehead. You can see that Photoshop has used this same content-aware technology to heal this location after I move the mouth from it. And one thing that makes this tool extra neat is that we can change some of its options after we've already moved it. If we click this gear wheel, two number boxes come up, one for structure and one for color. These numbers indicate how much you're willing to compromise on what you've selected and allow Photoshop to take over. The higher structure is, the less Photoshop is going to change your original selection's structure. The higher color is, the more you're allowing Photoshop to automatically manipulate the color to match its surroundings. Obviously, these numbers are going to affect different selections in different ways, but I find that the best numbers in this case are 3 and 10. When we're done, we'll just deselect by hitting Ctrl-D on our keyboard. I don't know about you, but I think this poor woman has been through enough in this tutorial. We'll go over some more manipulation tools in the next video. Hello, and welcome back to another Eduonics tutorial. In this section, we'll be going over the different tools in Photoshop, and in this video, we'll be picking up where we left off in the manipulation tools. Here, I have a photo of a very smooth, confident man looking directly at us. But it's hard to take him seriously when his pupils are suffering from a major case of red eye. Red eye is an unfortunate consequence of someone looking directly into the camera lens as the camera flash goes off. It mostly happens in environments with low lighting and with cameras that have a flash located very close to the lens. Basically, the flash is bouncing off his retinas to reflect right back into the lens, resulting in these eerie red pupils. Fortunately, Photoshop provides a very fast and easy way to fix this. The first manipulation tool we'll be going over in this video is one of the easiest to use in Photoshop. So let's go to the Tools panel, right-click the Healing Flyout menu, and select the Red Eye tool. And now, all we have to do is click somewhere in the redness of these eyes. Here's 1, and here's 2. Much better. There's a photo I can take a little more seriously. Still, there's another thing that's bugging me about this photo. This man has some good facial hair, but it's looking a little patchy in some areas. To help fix this, I'm going to go to my next manipulation tool, the Clone Stamp tool. Back in the Tools panel, we're going to skip past our brush tools, since we'll cover them in another video, and go straight to our Clone Stamp tool. The Clone Stamp tool functions a lot like the Healing Brush tool, but without any automated features. Instead, the Clone Stamp tool produces an exact duplicate of what you've sampled. So, in order to fill these empty patches without hair,
I'm going to press and hold the Alt key on my keyboard and click on a bearded area to set my sample. When I'm done setting my sample, I'll release my Alt key. Now, as I hover the clone stamp tool around, you can see that my cursor is now an exact duplicate of what I sampled. So, using the area that I sampled, I'll go in and brush in these patchy areas. But remember, my sample point is coming from an exact copy of the entire image. So if I go too far with it, I'll get back to the patchy area I wanted to remove in the first place. So what if we want to sample a specific area as a repeating pattern instead? This leads us to our next tool. Right-click the Clone Stamp tool to get to the Pattern Stamp tool. The Pattern Stamp tool takes one of your existing saved patterns and allows you to paint it in. If we pay attention to our tool options on top, it shows us the pattern that we're currently sampling from. And in the Pattern Picker, there's a whole list of other patterns available by default. I want to pattern part of his beard. And there are no patterns here that look anything like a beard. So what I'm going to have to do is make my own pattern. I'm going to go over back to the Tools panel and click my rectangular marquee tool. Then draw a selection around part of his beard. This area looks pretty good. To save it as a pattern, I'll go up to Edit, Define Pattern. I'll name this Beard and click OK. Before I proceed, I don't want to be manipulating only this area, so I'll deselect by hitting Ctrl D on my keyboard. Now I'll go back to the Pattern Stamp tool, and in the tool options, I'll go to the Pattern Picker and select the new pattern that I just made. Once I have my pattern ready, I'll go over to a patchy area of his beard and just paint it in. Now, when using the Pattern Stamp tool, it's important to remember that it does not function quite like a healing tool. It is merely allowing you to use a defined pattern as a brush. If you keep brushing with it and get carried away, it's going to make the edges of the pattern very obvious and it's not going to look natural. So, using this tool in this circumstance isn't really practical unless you exercise restraint. We briefly touched on the History panel in the last video. Let's go back to it now. When we open the History panel, it shows us a list of the changes we've made since we first opened this document. The top option being the original document before we ever did anything. We already know that clicking any of these options will take us back to that history state in the document. But what if I just want to sample one of these options without completely switching to it? This is where the History Brush tool comes into play. In the Tools panel, I'm going to select the History Brush tool directly below our clone tools. Then, back in the History panel, pay attention to this icon to the left of the state of our original document. This icon represents the state that the History Brush will sample back to. I'm going to go down and click the box next to Clone Stamp, so the History Brush will sample the state before I use the Pattern Stamp tool. Now, when I brush in this area, you can see that the Pattern Stamp is disappearing. Now watch what happens when I try to brush in where I used my Clone Stamp tool. Absolutely nothing changes because my History Brush isn't sampling a state before I use my Clone Stamp tool. Let's undo everything I just did by going up to the Pattern Stamp in the History panel. Now I'm going to select the History box for my original document before I remove the red eyes. Now, when I use the History Brush to brush in one of his eyes, it goes back to red. But none of my other changes are affected unless I were to brush them in as well. To once again undo what I just did, I will select Pattern Stamp above the History Brush state. As you can see, the History Brush tool and panel can be very powerful features when used together. Next up, let's right-click our History Brush tool to get to our Art History Brush tool. This one is kind of a stretch from the tools we've used so far, but stay with me. The first thing I plan to do is to fill my canvas with black. Then I can use the Art History Brush tool to paint in our image from its current state. To fill the canvas with black, I'll go up to Edit, Fill. Then under Use, I'll select Black. And then I'll hit OK. Now I'll go over to the History panel again and click the History Brush box above my current history state, Fill. So it's sampling a state in my document from where I filled it with black. Now I can hide my History panel and go over to my brush options. For this first option, I'm going to set the size to 40 pixels. And then I'll set the hardness to 80%. Then I'll go ahead and skip over to opacity and set that to 80%. For style, I want to set it to tight medium. Now I will begin brushing my main outline in a circular fashion. Nothing fancy, just setting the outline of my subject and making sure that all the gaps inside are filled, starting from the outside and spiraling inward. Then I'm going to lower the size of my brush to 30 pixels by hitting the left bracket key on my keyboard a couple of times. Once again, I will paint in, but this time I will focus where the eyes, mouth, and cigar will be. Starting with the eyes and ending with the cigar, I will repeat this process a few times, each time hitting my left bracket key once or twice and brushing the details in. As you can see, the smaller I make the brush, the more detailed the strokes appear. Finally, I will get to a very small brush which I can use to help touch up the areas that I want to draw focus. Now, you can finally see what the Art History Brush is capable of. It lets you very easily paint in a pre-existing image, making it seem like you've painstakingly brushed every single stroke. That will do it for this section of the manipulation tools. I will cover the final section in the next video.
Hello, and welcome back to another Eduonics tutorial. In this section, we'll be going over the different tools in Photoshop, and in this video, we'll be finishing off the manipulation tools. This time, I'm going to get going with the eraser tool. One of the simplest tools in Photoshop. It's basically a brush that erases anything on a layer while the layer is selected. Now, when I use this a little bit, you'll notice that the color the eraser is leaving behind is white. By default, you cannot erase content on a locked background layer. Instead, Photoshop will fill the erased content with your current background color. The background color is located in the Tools panel near the bottom. These two boxes represent our foreground and background color swatches. If you click the one on the right, it will bring up our background swatch picker, and over here you can see that our background color is set to white. Let's try changing the background color to something else, like red. Now when I use the eraser tool, Photoshop is automatically filling the layer with our background color, which is currently set to red. Fortunately, this is a behavior that only happens when you try to erase a locked background layer. I'm going to undo all of my erasing by going up to the History panel and clicking my original document. To unlock my background layer, I'm just going to double click it and then click OK. Now when I use my eraser tool, you can see that it is leaving behind a checkerboard pattern instead, which indicates that these areas of the layer are completely transparent. If I click the eye icon next to my layer to hide it, you can see that the checkerboard pattern remains. The checkerboard pattern is the blank canvas of Photoshop. It's your document without any content on it. One thing to know about the eraser tool is that it is a destructive tool. And what I mean by that is that when you use it, it literally destroys the areas of the layer that are erased. And you can't show those areas again unless you undo everything by going back in your history state. Let's say that I want to start erasing this background here in the bottom left corner. I'm going to increase my eraser size by hitting the right bracket key on my keyboard a few times, then I'll get to work on erasing. Everything's going good at first, but eventually I'm going to make a mistake and start erasing her shoulder. I could go back to my history panel and undo it, but it's going to take all the work I did with it. This is the only reason why I don't use the eraser tool very often. So, a good habit to get into is to duplicate your layer before you make any destructive changes to it. I'll go up to the history panel and go back to my document's original history state. What I like to do whenever I open an existing image is to drag the background layer to the new layer icon. Then click the eye on my original background layer to hide it. This is great because it gives me instant access to my original image while keeping it locked and hidden keeps me from accidentally altering it in any way. So now if I make any mistakes on my duplicate, I can just copy the original again and keep going. Now, I'd like to get rid of this background and leave only this lady. I'm going to start using my eraser tool to erase around her. But you can see that a lot of hair is being cut off by my eraser tool. In fact, it would nearly be impossible to erase this background without erasing a lot of other details with it. This is where our next tool comes in. Right-click the Eraser flyout menu and click the Background Eraser tool. I'm going to increase the size with my right bracket key until it gets pretty big. When I start erasing, I'm going to focus on this tiny crosshair in the middle. For this tool, whatever color is touching the crosshair will be removed. I'm going to make sure that the crosshair only touches the color I want to remove, and I'm only going to click once at a time. You can see that the background eraser tool is erasing the background color I want removed, but if I click and drag, the crosshair is going to graze over some of those strands of hair and start erasing those too. Up here in the tool options, I'm going to switch the sampling from continuous to once, which is just one button over. Now, if I click with the crosshair in the background,
I can drag anywhere I want because the tool is now only going to erase the first color I click. This is looking better, but I want to take this to the next level. Hair is notoriously difficult to work around, especially when you have all these thin strands that fray out from the rest. I'm going to show you a very easy way of using this tool to erase the background and leave all the hair where it belongs. First, I'm going to delete this layer by dragging it to the delete icon, and make another duplicate of my original by dragging it to the new layer icon. I'm going to double click the name of this layer to rename it to hair. When I erase the background of this layer, I'd like to show white behind it. So I'll create a new layer by clicking the new layer icon. Then to fill it with white, I'm going to go up to Edit, Fill with White. Then I'll drag this white layer below the hair layer. Now, I'll select my hair layer and see what it looks like when I erase. With white as my new background, I can see these strands of hair a little clearer. That will help me to decide what tool settings might be best for this image. I'm going to go back up to the tool options and click the arrow for my brush preset picker. I'd like to use an eraser with a softer edge, so I'm going to reduce the hardness to around 50%. Also, when I drag this tool, I'd like the path to be a bit smoother too. So I'll reduce the spacing from 25% to 5%. I'll also go over to the limits and switch them from contiguous to discontiguous. I'm going to undo my last erase by hitting Ctrl-Z on my keyboard. Now when I erase, things feel a little bit smoother, and the softer edges will be much more forgiving if I make any minor mistakes. The hair is looking pretty good, but the tint is still looking a little green, which means that my tool isn't erasing quite enough instances of the background color. To improve this, I'll undo my erase and then go over to Tolerance. Tolerance sets the range of colors you want to erase. I'm going to increase this to about 65%. Now as I erase the background, the tool is removing just enough color to leave the hair untouched, and it's affecting just enough tint to make the hair look decent on a white background. But if I accidentally graze against the skin, you can see that the eraser tool is removing some tinting from the skin as well. I want to protect this skin from being affected, so I'll go up to the tool options once again and click the box Protect Foreground Color. Then I'll go and click my foreground swatch to bring up my color picker. Then I can sample a spot on her skin and click OK. Now when I erase the background, I can get closer to the skin without affecting it because it's being protected by the tool options. As I move around the image, I can keep changing my foreground color to match the areas I need to protect. If you look closely in her hair, you can see there's still some tint left over from the background. But I've already erased all of the background over here. How can I sample the color I want to remove? I'll just go back to sampling and switch it to background swatch. Then I'll select the background swatch in the tools panel and sample the color I want removed. Now I can erase an exact color without having to worry about what's in the crosshair. So with these settings, we can select the color we want to remove by setting the background color, and the color we want to keep by setting the foreground color. This is a fantastic way to erase backgrounds from a large variety of images, and I hope that you can add it to your usable techniques. Let's go to our next tool by right-clicking the Eraser flyout menu and pick the Magic Eraser tool.
The Magic Eraser tool works a lot like the Magic Wand tool, only instead of selecting a range of colors, it just deletes them. So if I just click over here on her right side, you can see that it's just deleting a certain range of colors beyond what I clicked. Just like the Magic Wand tool, I can change the tolerance to delete more or less colors based on what I clicked. And over here, I can uncheck contiguous to delete all instances of the colors across the whole image without having to directly click them. You can see that this probably isn't the best tool to use in this scenario. A better scenario would be an image with a very basic background and stark contrast in colors, without all these wispy hairs to get in the way. I'm going to undo this and go back to my background eraser tool to finish off this area. Back in the Tools panel, I'm going to choose the Blur tool, just the second set of tools below our eraser tools. This whole set of tools is very self-explanatory. The Blur tool is basically just a brush that blurs an image's edges as you drag it around. So if we wanted to blur her hair out a bit and make her face stand out a little bit more, all we would have to do is click and drag the Blur tool around her hair, and we'll see it gradually fade in focus. With the Blur tool, you can continue to apply it over the same area to blur it more and more. You can also set its initial strength in the tool options above. Let's go back to our Tools panel and right-click the Blur tool to bring up the flyout menu. I'm going to click the Sharpen tool. The Sharpen tool does the exact opposite thing that the Blur tool does. Simply drag it over an area you want to bring into more focus, and it will sharpen the edges and colors. It is, however, very easy to overdo it with the Sharpen tool, as it tends to chop all the colors down to their purest form and produce a lot of color noise. So, the Sharpen tool is best used in small doses. Now, back in the Tools panel, I'll right-click the Sharpen tool to get to the Smudge tool. The Smudge tool can be pretty fun. You can use a very strong smudge to affect a very large area, or you can decrease the strength of the smudge to make some more minor changes. Either way, this is a fun tool to mess around with. If you enable finger painting in the tool options above and pick a foreground color you want to use, you can smudge with color as if you were finger painting. Pretty neat. Skin can be very temperamental in images, and sometimes when you want to make some very minor changes, you can wind up ruining skin tones and making things look awful. Go over to the Tools panel and select the Dodge tool. The Dodge tool allows you to target different tones of color and brighten them. To remove some of these shadows on her neck, I'm just going to paint with my Dodge tool in the areas I want to brighten up. You can see that here in the tool options under Range, we have midtones selected. This means that the tool is currently targeting the areas that are neither very bright or very dark. Instead, it's falling somewhere in the middle. I'm going to click and change this to shadows instead. So I can go back down here and finish off some of the darker areas that I couldn't get the first time around. If we go back up, we also have this option here to protect tones. This is especially helpful when working with skin because it works to preserve the colors so the tool only focuses on the brightness of an area. Back in the Tools panel, I will right-click my Dodge tool to get to the Burn tool. The Burn tool works in the exact opposite way from the Dodge tool in that it darkens areas instead of brightening them. So with the Dodge tool, we're dodging shadows, and with the Burn tool, we're burning them deeper. I'm just going to darken some of these shadows under her eyes so you can see what I mean. Back in the Tools panel again, I'm going to right-click my Burn tool
to get to the sponge tool. This one works very differently from the other tools in this flyout. It affects the saturation of an image. Up in the tool options, the mode is set to desaturate. So, as we brush this around, you can see that it's sapping all of the color out of her face, making it appear more black and white. Changing the mode to saturation will have the opposite effect and make the colors much more vivid. This flow option sort of serves as the tool's strength. The higher it is, the more work the tool will do. You may find, though, that the more that you desaturate an area, the harder it will be to resaturate that area with the tool, since the tool will no longer have any more colors to saturate. Okay, we've discussed the tools we can use to select the pixels of an image, and we've gone over the tools we can use to manipulate those areas of an image. In the next section, I'll go over how to create things in Photoshop from scratch with the creation tools.
Hello and welcome back to another Eduonics tutorial. In this section, we'll be going over the different tools in Photoshop, and in this video, we'll be starting the creation tools. We've gone over the tools to select a layer's contents, we've gone over the tools to manipulate those contents, but all of those are things that you do to pre-existing images. How do we go about creating new content in Photoshop from scratch? One way is with the creation tools. Since we're going to be creating from scratch, I'm going to make a new blank document to use as our canvas. To do that, I could go up to File, New, or I could use my keyboard shortcut by hitting Control-N on my keyboard. For this document, I'm going to go ahead and use the default Photoshop size, 7 inches by 5 inches, with a resolution of 72 pixels per inch and a white background. But I'm only going to use this canvas to play around with the tools, and I think it might be more fun to have a background color besides white. So I'm going to click this little swatch picker on the right, choose a light color for my background, and click both OK buttons to create my new document. The creation tool I'll be starting with is the brush tool. It's in the top third section of the tools panel, located directly below the healing tools. Before I start brushing, I want to make sure that it's going on a separate layer from my background. So I'll go down to the bottom of the layers panel and click the new layer icon. If you've been following the last few videos, you already have a head start on how brushes work. The quick selection, healing, clone stamp, history brush, and eraser are all examples of tools that utilize the same basic brush technology. The difference with using the brush tool directly is that the options for application become practically limitless. I'm going to try using the brush in its default state on my new blank layer. You can see that we're using a small black brush with a very soft edge. Let's check out the most basic options we have. Up in the tool options, I'll click the button for the brush preset picker. Here we have an option for the size of the brush. And here we have an option for the hardness of the brush. I'm going to increase the hardness to 100%. Then I'll brush a little bit on my blank layer. Now you can see that the edge of the brush is much harder, making it seem more focused. I'm going to go back to the brush preset picker. If we look below the option for hardness, we see a bunch of thumbnails of various shapes and sizes. These are brush presets that come with Photoshop by default. I'm going to click on the first one in the third row here called flat, blunt, short, stiff, and brush with it. You can see that this brush behaves in a completely different way from our standard default brush. It doesn't stop here either. If you go back up to the brush preset picker, there are many more presets if you just scroll down a little bit. And if you go up to this gear wheel button on the top right, there are entire sets of brushes that look and function in completely different ways. It really shows you how much diversity Photoshop has to offer, even by default. It's nice to have all of these options, but what if you want to create your own brush entirely? No problem. Let's say I want to make a brush out of all these strokes I've made. All I have to do is Control-click on my layer thumbnail to select all the contents of that layer. Then I'll go up to Edit, Define Brush Preset. I'm going to rename this to New Brush and click OK. Now I will deselect my previous brush strokes by pressing Ctrl-D on my keyboard. Then I'll delete this layer by dragging it to the delete icon at the bottom of the layers panel, and create a new blank layer by clicking the new layer icon. As I hover around my canvas with the brush tool, you can see an outline of the new brush I made. It's a little big at the moment, so I will decrease the size by hitting the left bracket key on my keyboard a few times. Now I'll just brush with it a bit. You can see that it's using an exact copy of what I selected as a functioning brush. And this is just the beginning. If we want to customize further, all we have to do is go up to the Tool Options and click the Brush Panel button. This brings up many more options to play with. You can see that not only do we have a bunch of presets in this section on the right, but we also have these individual settings on the left. I'm not going to go through all of these, but I'll give you a basic idea of what we're dealing with. If I click here on the second option, Shape Dynamics, it will replace our preset viewer with the Shape Dynamics options. The first slider we have is the size jitter. In Photoshop, jitter basically means the amount of randomness. So 0% jitter will stick with your original design, whereas 100% jitter will be completely random. I'm going to go ahead and increase this all the way to 100%. Then I'm going to brush just a little bit on the canvas. You can see that the brush is continuing to use my custom preset, but it's randomly changing the size of the shape as I drag. Back in the brush panel, I'm going to go up to the scattering option, directly below the shape dynamics. I'll go ahead and increase the scattering to about 200%. Now as I brush in the canvas, the initial instance of my brush is being randomly sized and scattered away from my pointer. Finally, if we want to change the color of our brush, all we have to do is change the foreground color down here in the Tools panel. I'll go ahead and change my foreground color to a shade of green. Then I'll brush in the canvas again. You can see that through these options, we can customize some very complex and unique images to help create content in Photoshop from scratch. The next tool I'll be going over is very similar to the brush tool. Back in my Tools panel, I'm going to right-click my brush tool to bring up the flyout menu and choose the Pencil tool. The Pencil tool can use a lot of the same presets that the brush tool uses, but it functions just a little bit differently. When I hover over my canvas and brush with it, straight away you can see that the default size is extremely thin. In fact, if I open up the preset picker,
you can see that the size is set to 1 pixel wide. But just like with the brush tool, I can still control the size whenever I like. Another way the pencil tool differs from the brush tool is how it handles hardness. Down here in the hardness, the pencil tool is set at 100% hardness. I'm going to go ahead and increase the size of the brush to about 70 pixels. That way I can see the edges of the brush a little bit better. Then I'll use the pencil to do a little bit of brushing here. So my pencil is brushing with a very hard edge, which is to be expected since it is at 100% hardness. Now I'll go back to the preset picker and I'll try reducing the hardness to 0%. Watch what happens when I try brushing again. You can see that adjusting the hardness did nothing at all. This is just how the pencil tool operates as opposed to the brush tool. Another thing that sets the pencil tool apart is up here in the tool options. Here's a button that says Auto Erase. I'm going to select it and then go back to my canvas. Now I'll click outside my penciling and drag over my previous penciling. It doesn't seem like Auto Erase is erasing anything at all. But watch what happens when I click and drag with my crosshair starting inside my penciling. Now the tool is brushing with black. And if we check over in the Tools panel, we can see that it's because my background color is black. As I use the pencil tool, I can continue making lines inside themselves, and Photoshop will automatically switch between my foreground and background colors. If we want to manually switch between foreground and background colors, we can go back to the Tools panel and click this tiny curved double arrow. And my background will become my foreground, and vice versa. We can also switch foreground and background colors on the fly, just by hitting X on the keyboard. This can be extremely useful as you're brushing, being able to switch colors at any time with the X key. Another neat thing we can do with all the brush tools is constrain them with the Shift key. If I start dragging my brush, then press and hold my Shift key, Photoshop automatically constrains my brush to paint in a straight line. This works whether I'm painting horizontally or vertically. My favorite thing about using the Shift key while brushing is this. I'm just going to click once with my brush over here. Then I will press and hold my Shift key before I click for the second time all the way over here. I can continue this process as long as I like, just holding the Shift key and clicking once at a time to set points for Photoshop to draw between. That will do it for these brush and pencil tools. We'll go over some more creation tools in the next video. Hello and welcome back to another Eduonics tutorial. In this section, we'll be going over the different tools in Photoshop, and in this video, we'll be finishing off the creation tools. The final creation tools we'll be going over are the shape tools. The shape tools are located a ways below the pen tools, but they are very much related to each other, and I will show you why. First, I'll use my rectangle shape tool to make a simple rectangle on my canvas. So a few things have happened. I made the rectangle, my properties panel has popped up, and there is a new layer in my layers panel called rectangle 1. So I have a shape layer in my layers panel. But if I go over to my paths panel, you can see that my rectangle shape appears there as well. This is because, like I mentioned before,
The pen tools and the shape tools are very much related in that they are all vector objects. What is a vector object? In Photoshop, there are a few different ways to display images. One way is through raster graphics, and another way is through vector graphics. Raster graphics are made up of pixels and are best for real-life photos, whereas vector graphics are mathematical calculations that are best for simple paths and lines, like logos. There are benefits and drawbacks to each, but that's why Photoshop provides us with both of them as options. Since I've already made a vector rectangle, I'll show you what a raster rectangle looks like. I'll switch back to my Layers panel, make a new blank layer by clicking the New Layer icon at the bottom of the Layers panel. Then I'll go up to my Rectangular Marquee tool and make a rectangle-shaped selection. I'm going to fill this with black to match the other rectangle. I'll hit Shift F5 on my keyboard to bring up my fill window. Here I will set my fill to black and hit OK. Then, to deselect this rectangle, I'll just hit Ctrl D. To make sure that we'll remember how to distinguish these two rectangles, I'll go up to the Layers panel and rename this to Raster. Then I'll rename the other layer to Vector. Now I'll select my raster layer and switch to my eraser tool and do some erasing. The raster rectangle is behaving as expected, and the more I use the eraser, the more pixels are being destroyed from its fill. Now, with my eraser tool still enabled, I'll select my vector layer and start erasing. Instead of erasing, a notification has appeared, and it wants me to rasterize the layer before proceeding. This is because this rectangle isn't made up of pixels that we can erase with raster tools. Instead, vector requires you to alter the shape path with vector tools. Now, since vector graphics aren't comprised of pixels, they can serve many applications that raster graphics can't. But the same is true the other way around. That's why we have reason to be happy that Photoshop offers both. Anyways, I'll delete these layers and move on to the next shape tool. I'm just going to right-click the rectangle tool to bring up the Shape Tool flyout menu and select the Rounded Rectangle tool. Then I'll click and drag it onto my canvas. Another neat thing about vector shapes in Photoshop is that you have immense control over their properties. If I go up here in the tool options, I have a full bar of buttons to play with. The main ones are the fill, stroke, width, height, and in the case of the rounded rectangle tool, the radius. As you may have guessed, if I go over and click the fill thumbnail, I can change the fill color to whatever I like. But an option you may be unfamiliar with is here in the stroke. I can select another color, and you can see that it basically outlines my rectangle with that color. I can then adjust the size of that outline with this slider. I can also go over here and change the style of the stroke. Then this button on the bottom left
affects whether the outline appears outside, inside, or centered onto my shape. The next options are a little more standard, but they're still important. Here I can change the width of my shape, and here I can change the height. Right now, the width and height are unconstrained, operating independently from each other. That's where this button between them comes in. If I select this, and then try to change the width, you can see that now the height follows it, scaling proportionately. And finally, something that sets the rounded rectangle tool apart from the regular rectangle tool is this option, radius. This controls the radius or curve length of the edges. If I decrease the radius, the rectangle will develop harder edges. Whereas if I increase the radius, the rectangle will appear more rounded. I'm going back to the Tools panel again and right-clicking my rounded rectangle tool to bring up the Shape flyout menu. I'm not going to go over all the shape tools Photoshop has, not only for the sake of time, but also because most of them offer the exact same options we just went over. So I'm just going to skip down to the Line tool. One requirement that most paths and shapes have in Photoshop is that they be closed or loop back to their original starting point. The Line tool, on the other hand, lets you make a single line without having to loop it back at all. Using this, you can make free lines using only the stroke as your color. The next shape tool is very special. I'm going to clear the canvas by deleting my current shape layers. Then I'll just right-click the Line tool and hover over the Custom Shape tool. You can see that instead of being a rectangle or a circle or a line, the icon shows an indistinct shape. I'll go ahead and select it. Then just start dragging onto my stage. Look at that! It's an arrow instead. I'm going to go up here in the tool options to this icon next to where it says Shape. Here's a whole bunch of pre-made custom shapes we can choose from. And if we click this gearbox on the right, there's a bunch of sets, each with pre-made custom shapes. And the beauty of these shapes is that we can edit them just like any other path with the vector tools. First off, if we need to select a path, we don't have to go all the way to the Paths panel. If I go over to the Tools panel and select the Path Selection tool, I can use this tool to select any path on a canvas, as long as I have the right layer selected with it. And if I want to select just one of these points, I'll go back to the Tools panel, right-click on my Path Selection tool, and pick the Direct Selection tool. Then I can use this to select and drag any one of these points wherever I want. These aren't the only tools we can use to manipulate paths. If I go back to my Pen tool flyout, I can choose the Add Anchor Point tool. This will allow me to create a new anchor point anywhere along the edge of my path. I can then switch back to the Direct Selection tool to select this point and move it wherever I like. If I decide that I don't like this point or any of the other points, I can go back to my Pen flyout menu, select the Delete Anchor Point tool, and click any anchor point I want to remove. Now, it should be noted that there are other ways to delete anchor points, but they will often break the closed loop of the path and cause problems for you down the road. If you want to delete any anchor points, I strongly recommend using the Delete Anchor Point tool. Finally, there's another path tool I want to quickly show you. I'll select one of these anchor points by first switching to the Direct Selection tool, then selecting a point. Remember these little handles? They control the curve of the line connected to the point. There's a tool that we can use back in the Pen tool flyout called the Convert Point tool. Then, if I use it to click a point with handles, it will remove the handles and make the lines perfectly straight. And the Convert tool also works the other way around. If there's a straight corner that we want to convert into a curve, we can just click that point and drag to create a curve with handles and all. Okay, that will do it for the creation tools. We're going to start going over the workspace tools in the next video.
Hello and welcome back to another Eduwonics tutorial. In this section, we'll be going over the different tools in Photoshop, and in this video, we'll be going over our final set of tools, the workspace tools. The workspace tools help you to navigate your canvas without necessarily altering your images. They're basically supplemental tools that just make your workspace fit better to your creative style. The first workspace tool I'll be going over is the eyedropper tool. It's located in the first quarter of the Tools panel, directly below the Crop tool. The eyedropper tool is a quick way to sample your foreground and background colors. Pay attention to my foreground color near the bottom of the Tools panel. Then watch as I click a color on my canvas. The eyedropper tool has switched my default foreground color of black to my new foreground color with just a click. Now, if I click a different color and hold, you can see that around my cursor is a big circle. This is called the sampling ring, and it's displaying the color I'm clicking on top of the ring while displaying the previous color I clicked on the bottom of the ring. Now if I want to choose my background color with the eyedropper tool, all I have to do is press and hold my Alt key before I click. You can see at the bottom of the Tools panel that both my foreground and background colors have been changed from their defaults using the eyedropper tool. I'll go to the Tools panel and right-click the eyedropper tool to bring up the flyout menu, and select our next tool, the Color Sampler. The Color Sampler is sort of similar to the eyedropper tool. It's just more suited for getting information on the colors that you choose. I'll just use the tool and click in my image. Instead of changing my foreground color, the Sampler tool has just placed a crosshair with the number 1 below it. I can click again in another area, and another area. Photoshop allows you to sample up to 10 colors with this tool. And you can see it's adding these colors to my info panel on the right. The info panel is displaying the number values for the colors I've clicked. I can bring up different values by clicking these mini eyedropper thumbnails. I'll go in the Tools panel and right-click the Color Sampler to bring up the flyout menu, and select our next tool, the Ruler tool. It's fairly common to need to know the length and width of your image. To do that, we can just hit Ctrl-R on the keyboard to enable our rulers. But occasionally, you need to know the length of something specific inside your image. To do that, we can just click and drag with the Ruler tool. As I drag,
you can see the values on top in my tool options change. Now that I've measured an area on my image, I can check these values on top. Here in X and Y is the location on the canvas where I used my ruler. Then, as I look further on the right, here's my ruler width, height, and the angle of my ruler. If we want to use this angle to rotate the image, I'll just go over to this Straighten Layer option, and it will rotate the image to a point where the ruler will be completely level. I'll hit Ctrl-Z on the keyboard to undo this rotation. I'll go to the Tools panel and right-click the Ruler tool to bring up the flyout menu, and select our next tool, the Note tool. The Note tool can be extremely helpful for setting reminders or coordinating with other designers. When I click with it in my canvas, it adds this little floating icon that I can drag anywhere inside my image or outside my image in the gray space. Over here in the right, my Notes panel has popped up. Here I can write a little note as a reminder for myself to remove background. And if I happen to be working with other designers, I can go up in the tool options and write my name in the author box. Matthew Brown. Now, if I pass this file on to someone else, they will see my note with my name and message on it. I'll go ahead and make another note on my canvas. Then write background removed, as if somebody else wrote it. I'll also go up here in the tool options and change the color so this note stands out a little more from the other one. If these notes are getting in the way, but I don't want to delete them, I can just go up to View, Show, Notes. This will hide all my notes until I enable them again, or start using the Note tool again. If I really want to delete one of these notes, I can just click one, then click the trash icon on the bottom to delete it. And if I want to delete all my notes, I can just go up in the tool options and click Clear All. I'll go over the Tools panel near the bottom and select our next tool, the Hand tool. The Hand tool doesn't move the image. It moves your view of the image. I'll just click and drag. And you can see it just lets you center specific areas of the image. This is especially useful if you're working on an image very closely and it takes up your whole canvas. The keyboard shortcut for the Hand tool is the spacebar. And like with most tool shortcuts, you can have an entirely different tool selected while you use the shortcut to temporarily switch to another tool, only to switch back to your original tool as soon as you release the key. I'll right-click the Hand tool to get to our next tool, the Rotate View tool. This one works a lot like the Hand tool, only instead of moving your view around, it rotates it. If I click and drag, it rotates my view at the very center of my window. So I can hold spacebar to move a corner of my image to the center of my window. Then I'll use Rotate View to start rotating from that point. Now it's important to remember that this isn't affecting your image at all. It's just rotating your current perspective of the image. So if I were to save this image and reopen it, it will be straightened out like I never rotated it at all. Up in the tool options, it displays the exact rotation. So if we have a specific angle in mind, say 45 degrees, we can just type 45 in the box to rotate there. And if we want to see things as they were before we rotated, we can just click this button here called Reset View. The next tool should be somewhat familiar. It's directly below the Rotate View tool in the Tools panel, shown by a magnifying glass. It's the Zoom tool. I'll just use it to click in my canvas to zoom in increments. By default, the Zoom tool wants to zoom in. To zoom out, all we have to do is hold the Alt key before we click, and it zooms out. Up in the tool options, if Scrubby Zoom is enabled, we can click and drag in the canvas to the right or to the left to zoom in and out. And if I go back up and disable Scrubby Zoom, I can click and drag my Zoom tool to make a rectangular marquee. Once I release, it will zoom to show what's inside my rectangle. We've already touched on the foreground and background colors. I'll just go over them again so we're all on the same page. I can click the box on the top left to set my foreground color, and the box on the bottom right to set my background color. Then I can switch them with the curved double arrow on the top right. Then switch back to my default colors with this button on the top left. Below the color swatches is a button for Quick Mask Mode. If I click this now, nothing happens. This is because we don't have any selections in our canvas. I'll disable it by clicking it again. Then I'll use my rectangular marquee tool to make a selection. Now that I have my selection, I'll hit Q on my keyboard to enable Quick Mask Mode again. Now you can see the area that I selected with the rest of the image tinted in red. Quick Mask Mode basically allows you to view your selection in a different way so that you can use different tools to edit your selection. Masks can be amazing for making and editing selections. I'll go more in depth with masks in another video. Finally, we have the last button in the Tools panel, the Window Mode button. If I click this once, it gets rid of my scroll bars on the bottom and on the right. This is just a way of working in Photoshop with a bit of a cleaner canvas. Then, if I click the Window Mode again, a warning box pops up. Basically, this is letting us know that we're about to enter full screen mode, and it will hide the Photoshop interface completely. I'm going to go ahead and click Full Screen to proceed. From here, we can show our panels again, just by hovering over the edge of the screen to the left or to the right. If we want to get back to the standard window mode, just hit the F key on the keyboard. And we're back. Okay, that will do it for the workspace tools, and the tools in general. In the tools section, we covered the tools to set selections, we covered the tools to manipulate the contents of those selections, we covered the tools to create content from scratch, and we covered the tools to make the workspace fit our needs. Now that we've covered this section on tools, I'll start going over a new section, Workflow, in the next video.